The specification landed on desks at the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment at Chertsey in 1967, and it asked for something the Americans had already decided was impossible. General Staff Requirement 3301 wanted a reconnaissance vehicle under 8 tons combat-loaded, air-portable in a Hercules, amphibious with minimal preparation, capable of ground pressure lower than a soldier's boot, and armed well enough to kill a BTR-60 at fighting range. The Ministry of Defense had watched the Americans spend the better part of a decade trying to build the M551 Sheridan into a light-armoured vehicle that could do reconnaissance, airborne assault, and tank killing in a single hull. And Whitehall had drawn a different conclusion from the same problem. You could not, the British Army had realised, buy one vehicle to do everything. You bought a family. Alvis at Coventry, working to the Chertsey specification, would build 7 variants on a common hull: gun, mortar, missile, command, ambulance, recovery, engineer reconnaissance, and the whole family would weigh less than a single Sheridan. The lead variant, the FV-101 Scorpion, carried a 76mm gun in a 2-man turret, and a Jaguar J60 petrol engine borrowed from the XK saloon. It looked to American liaison officers visiting Chertsey like a toy. It was not a toy. The Sheridan had entered service with the US Army in 1966 as the M551 Armoured Reconnaissance/Airborne Assault Vehicle, and by 1969 the Combat Developments Command at Fort Belvoir was quietly compiling a list of things wrong with it that ran to several hundred items. The aluminium hull cracked under the recoil of its own 152mm gun. The Shillelagh missile system, which was supposed to give the Sheridan a standoff tank-killing capability, the Scorpion could not match, misfired, failed to guide, or would not launch at all. The combustible cartridge cases for the conventional 152mm round absorbed moisture in humid conditions and left burning residue in the breach between shots. In Vietnam, where 64 Sheridans were deployed with the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment from January 1969, crews removed the Shillelagh equipment entirely and welded improvised armour to the belly to survive mines. The Joint Intelligence Committee in London followed the American troubles through the standard defence attaché channels at Grosvenor Square, and the picture that reached the MOD's General Staff Operational Requirements branch was of a program that had tried to answer every question at once and answered none of them well. The Chieftain, Britain's main battle tank, weighed 55 tons and mounted a 120mm gun. The Scorpion would weigh under 8 and mount a 76mm, and the space between them would be filled not by a single clever compromise but by Scimitar with its 30mm Radan, Striker with its swing-fire missiles, and Spartan carrying dismounts. Each vehicle would do one thing. The Sheridan, by 1970, was doing none of them. Alvis rolled the first production Scorpion out of the Coventry factory in January 1972. The Blues and Royals took delivery of their first squadron the following year. In Washington, the Army was already looking for something to replace the vehicle it had barely finished fielding. The paperwork trail on the Sheridan's troubles is thick, and much of what shaped British thinking about light armour in the early 1970s came from reading it. The US Army's Comptroller reported to Congress in 1969 that the M551 program had exceeded its original cost estimate by roughly 140%, that only a fraction of the vehicles delivered were mission-capable at any given time, and that the Shillelagh missile, which had absorbed the largest share of the development budget, had a success rate in operational testing that the report described in language calculated not to alarm. The figure, when it reached the Defence Intelligence Staff in London through liaison channels, was in the region of 1 hit in 3 under favourable conditions. Sir Michael Carey, Permanent Under-Secretary at the MOD from 1974, would later describe the Sheridan file in a Whitehall memorandum as a cautionary study in requirement creep, and the phrase entered the vocabulary of the Operational Requirements branch. The Scorpion had been designed against the opposite discipline. Colonel Willie Wilson, who chaired the General Staff Requirement Working Group in the mid-1960s, had insisted from the outset that the vehicle would be defined by what it would not do. It would not fight main battle tanks. It would not carry infantry into contact. It would not operate as a self-propelled anti-tank platform in the manner of the Sheridan's Shillelagh concept. It would find the enemy, report and withdraw, and if it had to fight, it would fight soft-skinned vehicles, light armour and infantry positions with a low-velocity 76mm gun firing HESH and canister. Everything else the army wanted from a light armoured family, anti-tank capability, mortar-carrying command post ambulance, would go on the same hull in different variants, and none of them would try to be the Scorpion. The philosophical distance between Chertsey and Fort Belvoir on this point was greater than the difference in the vehicles themselves. The Americans had built the Sheridan to be several things because the airborne divisions and the armoured cavalry regiments both needed something, and the Pentagon could afford one program rather than two. The British had built the CVR-T family to be one thing 7 different ways because Alvis could produce a common hull, a common engine, and a common running gear, and the Royal Armoured Corps would sort out the roles between them. When Major General Sir John Stanier, later Chief of the General Staff, inspected the first Scorpions at Bovington in 1972, he asked how many hours of driver training a National Service conscript would need to become competent on the vehicle. The answer he was given was 30. The Sheridan required significantly more, and a great deal of that training was spent on the missile system that its crews would, in Vietnam, remove and leave in the depot. The Foreign and Commonwealth Office had by this point begun to notice that the Scorpion was going to be sellable abroad in a way the Chieftain had never been. The first export order came from Iran in 1971, before the vehicle had entered British service. The Iranian order was for 250 vehicles, and it arrived at Alvis with a covering letter from the Imperial Iranian Ground Forces that specified desert modifications, air conditioning, and a delivery schedule the Coventry factory would struggle to meet. It was followed within 18 months by orders from Belgium, Oman and Nigeria, and by 1976 the CVR-T family was in service or on order with 14 armies. The Defence Sales Organisation at the MOD, run at that point by Sylvester Suffield, kept a running tally that it circulated to the Treasury each quarter, and by the mid-1970s the Scorpion was earning foreign exchange at a rate that made the entire development programme profitable in cash terms, a distinction the Chieftain, despite its own export successes in Iran and Kuwait, could not quite match on a per-unit basis. Belgium's decision was the one that Whitehall read most carefully. The Belgian army had considered the M551 Sheridan as a replacement for its aging M41 Walker Bulldogs in the reconnaissance role, had received a full briefing from the US Army Materiel Command, and had chosen the Scorpion instead. The Belgian Chief of Staff's assessment, shared through NATO channels and circulated within the MOD's Directorate of Military Operations, focused on availability rates and training burden rather than on combat performance. The Sheridan, the Belgians had been told frankly by their American counterparts, required a level of maintenance support that a conscript army with limited armoured experience would find difficult to sustain. The Scorpion, running on a modified Jaguar engine that any competent mechanic could service, and a suspension system derived from tractor practice, could be kept running by a Belgian conscript with a technical school certificate. This was not the argument the Americans had expected to lose. The Sheridan had been designed with the airborne divisions of the US Army in mind, and its aluminium hull and modest weight were meant precisely to make it deployable and sustainable in expeditionary conditions. What had happened was that the technology it carried, the missile, the combustible case ammunition, the fire control, had raised the sustainment burden to a level the vehicle's design weight was supposed to have avoided. The Scorpion had gone the other way. Its technology was deliberately modest. The 76mm gun was a scaled-down descendant of the Second World War Comet's armament. The engine was a civilian saloon car engine detuned for reliability. The fire control was an optical sight with no stabilization and no laser rangefinder in the original marks. What the vehicle offered was mobility, silence, and the ability to keep running, and in the reconnaissance role, those things mattered more than the ability to kill a T-62 at 2,000 meters. The Joint Intelligence Committee's assessments of Warsaw Pact reconnaissance doctrine in the same period supported the British reading. The Soviet BRDM-2 and the reconnaissance elements of the motor rifle divisions were expected to fight for information rather than steal it. And the British view was that fighting for information was a losing game against numerically superior Soviet formations on the North German plain. Better, Chertsey had concluded, to have a vehicle that could hide, watch, report, and leave. The German plain was where the Scorpion would have fought if the Cold War had gone hot, and the tactical logic that had shaped it was written in the terrain around the inner German border. The British Army of the Rhine's reconnaissance regiments, the 15th/19th the King's Royal Hussars, the 13th/18th Royal Hussars, the Blues and Royals in their reconnaissance role, operated on the northern flank of 1st British Corps, in country that was a mixture of open farmland, wooded ridges, and the small industrial towns of Lower Saxony. The problem the regiments had been given was to find the leading elements of the Soviet 3rd Shock Army and 20th Guards Army as they came west from their peacetime locations, to identify which axes they were taking, and to report in time for the covering force to fight a delaying action while the main defense went in on the Weser. This was not a mission the Sheridan had been built for, and it was not a mission the American armored cavalry regiments in Germany, the 2nd and 11th ACR watching the Fulda Gap and the Czech border further south, were expected to conduct in quite the same way. The American cavalry doctrine of the 1970s, articulated in FM 17-95, treated the covering force as a fighting force that would trade space for time by inflicting casualties on the advancing Soviet columns. The British reconnaissance doctrine, set out in the Staff College papers of the same period and refined by successive commanders of BAOR, was closer to what the SAS would have recognized as a stalking role. The Scorpion's design supported that. The Jaguar engine, when properly tuned, produced an exhaust note that at idle was almost inaudible at 100 meters. The rubber-bushed suspension made no metallic sound over rough ground. The vehicle's low silhouette, at 2.1 meters to the top of the turret, it was shorter than a man standing beside it, allowed it to hull down behind hedges and field boundaries that would have concealed nothing larger. Field Marshal Sir Nigel Bagnall, who commanded 1st Armoured Division and later I British Corps, was among the officers who argued through the 1970s and early 1980s for a maneuverist approach to the defence of Germany, and the CVR-T family fitted that approach better than any heavier alternative would have done. Bagnall's operational concept assumed that the covering force battle would be decided as much by what the reconnaissance regiments saw and reported as by what the tanks and infantry did once contact was made. A Scorpion troop that could infiltrate to a position overlooking a Soviet regimental axis, watch a division pass and withdraw before being engaged, was worth more to the corps commander than a Sheridan troop that could destroy a handful of Soviet vehicles before being destroyed itself. The American view, at least at the level of the 7th Army in Germany, was not so far from the British one, but the vehicle the Americans had been given did not support it. The Sheridan had been withdrawn from Germany by the mid-1970s, its role given to M60 tanks and M113 armoured personnel carriers, modified for reconnaissance. The gap that left in the American order of battle would not be properly filled until the M3 Bradley Cavalry fighting vehicle entered service in the early 1980s. The Bradley, when it came, was heavier than a Scorpion by a factor of 3, carried a 25mm chain gun and Tau missiles, and represented the American answer to the same reconnaissance problem the British had solved 15 years earlier, with different arithmetic. The two vehicles were not designed against the same requirement, and comparing them directly would be a category error. But the fact that the US Army had spent the intervening period without a satisfactory light-armoured reconnaissance vehicle, the Sheridan having been retired from most units by 1978, kept in service only with the 82nd Airborne Division for want of an alternative, was noted in the annual defence reviews prepared for the Cabinet by the Ministry of Defence. Sir Frank Cooper, Permanent Under-Secretary from 1976, took a particular interest in the comparative economics of Western armoured vehicle programmes, and his private papers, some of which have been released to the National Archives at Kew, show a Whitehall view of American procurement in the 1970s that was sympathetic but unillusioned. The Americans, Cooper's minutes suggest, had more money and less discipline than the British, and the combination produced programs that were technologically ambitious and operationally disappointing. The Scorpion had been built to a budget that would not have kept the Sheridan program in test rigs, and it had produced a vehicle that did what it had been asked to do. The Falklands would test that judgment in conditions no one at Chertsey had specifically planned for. When the task force sailed south in April 1982, the Blues and Royals took 2 troops of CVRT, 4 Scorpions and 4 Scimitars, aboard the RFA Sir Lancelot and the requisitioned MV Elk. The vehicles were by some way the heaviest armour the task force possessed. The question of whether they should go at all had been argued at the MOD in the last week of April, with some officers pointing out that the ground pressure of the CVRT was low enough to cross ground that would swallow a Land Rover, and others responding that the peat bogs of East Falkland had not been mapped for armoured vehicle movement, and that the vehicles might simply disappear. The argument for taking them was made forcefully by Major General Jeremy Moore, and at the political level by John Nott, the Defence Secretary, who had reviewed the ground pressure figures and concluded that the risk was worth taking. The vehicles landed at San Carlos on May 21, 1982, with the rest of 3 Commando Brigade, and they performed the role for which they had been designed: reconnaissance, fire support, and the covering of dismounted infantry, across ground that was worse than the North German plain in every respect, except the presence of the Soviet Army. Lieutenant Lord Robin Innes Kerr, commanding one of the Scorpion troops, took his vehicles across country west of Stanley that had been assessed as impassable to armour, and the Argentine forces defending the outer ring of positions around the capital found themselves engaged by 76mm HESH from directions they had not thought possible. The ground pressure figures from the Chertsey specification, which had looked academic in 1967, turned out to matter a great deal on June 13th, 1982, on the slopes below Mount Tumbledown. The Argentine 5th Marine Battalion, dug in on Tumbledown, had not expected to see British armour in the fight for Stanley, and the presence of Scorpions and Scimitars on their flank during the Scots Guards' assault on the night of 13th to 14th June contributed to the collapse of the defensive position at a moment when the battle was still in the balance. The vehicles had not in the end done anything the light infantry battalions could not have done without them. The fighting on Tumbledown was won by guardsmen with bayonets, but they had extended the reach of the ground force in a theatre where every additional capability mattered. The after-action reports that went back to the MOD and which formed part of the material Sir Frank Cooper's successor drew on for the Falklands Lessons Learned exercise made a specific point of the CVRT's reliability. Of the 8 vehicles landed, all 8 were still operational at the ceasefire. None had been lost to enemy action. 2 had been damaged and repaired in the field with the tools and spares carried by the crews. The Jaguar engine, which the Americans had regarded as a curiosity, had run on the fuel available in the theatre without significant modification. The comparison with the Sheridan's operational record in Vietnam, where availability rates in some units had fallen below 50%, and where the vehicle's aluminium hulls had proved catastrophically vulnerable to mines, was not made explicitly in the British reports because the British reports were not concerned with the Sheridan, but it was made privately in Whitehall by officers who had followed both programmes. Peter Hennessy, in his later work on the machinery of British defence policy, would identify the Scorpion as one of the few Cold War procurement programs that could be described as unambiguously successful in cost, capability and export terms, and The Falklands was the moment at which that judgment crystallized. The vehicle had been asked to do something outside its design envelope and had done it. The program had cost less than the Sheridans had cost. The export book had, by 1982, reached 19 countries and would eventually reach more than 30. The Americans in the same period were preparing for the entry into service of the M3 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicle, which would give the armoured cavalry regiments in Germany a proper reconnaissance vehicle for the first time since the Sheridan's withdrawal. The Bradley was a better vehicle than the Scorpion in almost every measurable respect. It was better armed, better armoured, better protected against chemical attack, and it carried scouts who could dismount and fight. It also weighed 22 tons in its cavalry variant, cost several times what a Scorpion cost, and could not be flown by a Hercules or floated across a river with a flotation screen. The two vehicles answered different questions, and both answers were defensible. But the British answer had been available for a decade before the American one, and had cost less to arrive at. This was the point that the defence sales organisation's export literature, prepared for the arms fairs of the 1980s, made in language calculated not to embarrass the Americans directly. The Scorpion was described as affordable, reliable and proven. The Sheridan by then was in storage. The Sheridan's second life came in 1989, when the 82nd Airborne Division took 14 of the vehicles it had kept in service into Panama for Operation Just Cause. And again in 1991, when the same division deployed with Sheridans to Saudi Arabia for Operation Desert Storm. The vehicles were used in both cases more as light tanks than as reconnaissance platforms, and their performance in both operations was adequate rather than distinguished. The Shillelagh missile system, which had absorbed so much of the original development budget, was not used operationally in either theatre. By that point, the Scorpion had been in continuous service with the British Army for 17 years and with foreign armies for even longer. The Chertsey specification, drafted in 1967 by officers who had never expected their vehicle to fight in the South Atlantic or the Persian Gulf, had produced a family of vehicles that could and did fight in both. The lesson that the British defence establishment drew from the comparison, a lesson articulated in the Statement on the Defence Estimates for successive years, and refined in the writing of Lawrence Freedman and other academic observers of the period, was not that the Sheridan had been a bad vehicle, or that the Scorpion had been a good one in some absolute sense. It was that the requirement in armoured vehicle design, as in much else, mattered more than the technology. The Sheridan had been asked to be too many things. It had been asked to be an airborne assault vehicle, a light tank, a reconnaissance platform, and a tank killer, and the technology that would have been required to make it all of those things at once, a stabilized gun launcher, guided munitions, sophisticated fire control, adequate armour, had exceeded what the aluminium hull and the design weight could carry. The Scorpion had been asked to be one thing, and everything else the Army wanted had gone on the same hull as a different variant. The design discipline had held. The program had come in near budget, on schedule, and had produced a vehicle that the British Army was still using in 1991 and would continue to use in progressively upgraded forms well into the following century. The Warrior Lessons team, established after the Gulf War to examine the performance of British armour in the desert, noted in its report that the Scorpions and Scimitars of the Household Cavalry Regiment in Iraq had performed reliably in a climate and terrain very different from either the North German Plain or the Falklands. The 30mm Radan cannon of the Scimitar, in particular, had proved effective against the Iraqi light armour it had been designed to defeat. The 76mm gun of the Scorpion, by then increasingly regarded as an obsolete weapon, was on its way to replacement, and the Scorpion itself would be withdrawn from British service in 1994. The wider CVR-T family would continue. This was the shape of a successful program. Not that every component lasted forever, but that the design had absorbed change and continued to earn its place. The archives at Kew hold in DEFE and WO files that have been progressively released since the late 1990s. The paper trail of the CVRT program from the first General Staff requirement papers of the mid-1960s to the Falklands after-action reports of 1982. The record they compose is not in the main dramatic. It is a record of committee minutes, of Treasury correspondence about unit costs, of trials reports from the Fighting Vehicles Research and Development Establishment, of export negotiations conducted through the Defence Sales Organisation. What emerges from it is not a story of British genius or American failure, but of two defence establishments answering a similar question in different institutional cultures and arriving at different answers. The American answer had more ambition and more money behind it. The British answer had more discipline and a clearer sense of what the vehicle was for. The Sheridan was not embarrassed by the Scorpion in any formal or publicly acknowledged sense. There is no report in the American archives that says so, and there is no memorandum in the British archives that claims it. What there is in both national records is evidence that officers who watched both programs drew conclusions about what worked and what did not, and that those conclusions influenced subsequent procurement. The Bradley program in its cavalry variant incorporated lessons from the Sheridan's failures and from observation of the Scorpion's successes. The British Warrior program, which produced the infantry fighting vehicle that entered service in 1988, incorporated lessons from the American experience with the Bradley and from the limits of the Scorpion in higher intensity roles. The traffic in lessons across the Atlantic was constant, mediated through the defence attachés, the standing exchange programs at Fort Knox and Bovington, and the intelligence sharing arrangements that governed the whole Cold War Anglo-American defence relationship. The Scorpion's contribution to that traffic was to demonstrate, at a moment when Western procurement was becoming increasingly expensive and technologically ambitious, that a modest specification, honestly executed, could produce a vehicle that would serve for decades in a wider variety of theatres than its designers had imagined. Sir Michael Quinlan, Permanent Under-Secretary at the MOD from 1988, would remark in the context of a different programme that the greatest enemy of the good was the perfect, and the Scorpion was a case in point. It was not a perfect vehicle. Its armour would not stop a heavy machine gun round at close range. Its gun was, by the standards of the 1980s, obsolete. Its crew of 3 worked in cramped conditions that would not have been accepted in a vehicle designed a decade later. It did what it had been asked to do, and it kept doing it. When the last Scorpion of the British Army was formally withdrawn from frontline service at a small ceremony at Bovington in 1994, the Alvis factory at Coventry had built more than 3,000 vehicles of the CVR T family for customers in more than 30 countries. The Sheridan program had produced 1,700 vehicles, all of them for the US Army, and by the same year the last of them had been placed in long-term storage or expended as targets on the ranges at Fort Irwin. The 2 vehicles had answered the same question. The answers were not the same.